Morning, everyone. One of the core texts that was requested that I do a little bit of a recap of was Sophocles' tragic play Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Tyrannus in Greek. Now, this play, like many of the tragedies we've read, is not actually set in Athens, but it seems to speak to a lot of the contemporary questions and conflicts that were going on in the 420s BCE, in which we know that this was performed. So let's go ahead and dive in on some of the key context pieces we can use when we think about this play. So, when I taught this play in lecture, I tried to hone in on three particular lenses or angles from which we might approach Sophocles' play. The first one, which we started with, was the historical context. What's going on in Athens at the time that this tragedy is being performed? Second, we thought about lens two, the politics. What might Sophocles be trying to communicate about contemporary political leadership, and specifically Pericles? And then finally, these bigger, more universal themes of what does it mean to be a human being? What kind of agency do we have over our own lives? And what is our relationship with destiny and the gods? This was the order in which we approached these questions in lecture, and so that's the order I'll continue with in this little recap today. So first, historical context. As I taught in class, Sophocles' Oedipus the King is composed and performed probably in the early 420s, maybe 428, 427, and that is a rough time for Athens. The 420s is really the first phase of the major Peloponnesian War. That's the war between Athens and her allies and Sparta and her allies. So we've got this kind of league versus league, team versus team, major warfare erupting throughout the Greek world. And we know that in this early phase of the Peloponnesian War, what's happening, you kind of see it in this map, is this two-pronged attack in which Sparta is invading by land the Athenian Attic territory, and the Athenians are launching their ships around the Peloponnese basically every summer. So prolonged warfare between these two city-states and their allies. And because of this type of warfare, we know that the Athenians during the summer months are bringing their citizen population in to the city itself, behind the city walls, and that heavy urban density is leading to a plague. And plague, of course, is going to be the setting for Oedipus the King, right? There was a plague in Thebes, citizens are dying, and Oedipus as king is trying to figure out what to do, what's at fault, who is to blame for this sort of curse of Apollo. So even though, again, the play is set in a mythical Theban time that seems unrelated to Athens, there's a very clear historical parallel between the situation in which the Athenians find themselves in the 420s and the setting, the premise in which Sophocles sets Oedipus and the citizens of Thebes. So the second thing we thought about was how deliberations on Oedipus as a king might reflect back on the political leaders of Athens. I mentioned that, at least in an earlier phase of classical scholarship, one traditional way of reading the play was to think about how Oedipus might reflect on Pericles. Pericles, we know, dies of the plague himself in 429 BC. And so if Oedipus the King is being performed just a few years after that, it might be hard for Athenian audiences not to think about the man who sort of represented a father figure to the Athenians. But as we know, Oedipus in the play is sort of an ambivalent political leader. On the one hand, he is the beloved father of his people. Remember at the beginning of the tragedy when the Thebans come to his palace and they call him, "O Father," right? And he calls them, "O Children." But we know that as the play goes on, Oedipus seems to be exhibiting increasingly troubling political behavior, even tyrannical behavior, right? The play is Oedipus Tyrannos. What things has he done that might make us think of him as a tyrant-like figure, almost like Creon in Antigone? Well, of course, he becomes increasingly paranoid about who might be trying to scheme against his power. The knowledge eventually sort of dawns on him that he has committed some of the worst crimes in ancient Greek civilization, right? Incest with his mother and patricide, that is killing his own father, even though it was unknown to him. And we know that as he goes through the process of seeking this knowledge, he uses escalating methods of bullying, insults, even torture in order to gain the self-knowledge that he so desperately seeks. And this, of course, might be a reflection on Pericles as the father figure of Athens, who unknowingly created this strategy that would lead to their demise, right? It is Pericles' idea to pull the Athenian citizens behind the city walls. But it might not be a direct reflection on Pericles at all. It might just be thinking about, now that Pericles is gone, who is going to fill this vacuum of leadership? What does good leadership look like? Should we even trust our leaders? It might be a bigger question just about Athenian governance and not about any one individual. Of course, I want to close on this last lens, which is where we spent a lot of our time in the second half of this lecture, which was thinking about Oedipus the king, not merely in the 420s, in the political wake of Pericles, but as a play about larger, more universal themes of gods and men. When we look at Oedipus, we are evaluating how human beings behave under conditions of limited knowledge, right? We see that Oedipus doesn't have the full picture and is trying to lead his city even in that blind spot. And of course, I pointed out that there are maybe opposite ways to think about Oedipus's guilt and blame. Is he a victim? Is he a plaything of the gods, an inescapable member of this cursed family line? Or might we actually put some of the blame back on Oedipus? Sure, he doesn't know when he's a young man that he is destined to kill his father and sleep with his mother, but it's unavoidable that he does in fact commit these crimes out of an ignorance of self. And I ended class, of course, by trying to mediate between these two grounds, to say that it's, of course, perfectly possible to read the play either in one light or the other. But maybe a different way we want to think about it is not just about blaming or exculpating Oedipus, but thinking about how this play highlights the unknowable, right? That the human condition in some ways is always conditioned by our lack of the full picture, and the understanding that we are mere mortals trying to struggle through difficult circumstances that don't always make sense to us. And we might either despise or admire Oedipus for not giving up the pursuit of self-knowledge, even when it means destroying himself and his family to do so. All right, as you prep for exam, if you want to think a little bit more deeply about this play, a couple of key characters to review. I would expect you to be able to know and describe who Oedipus, Creon, Tiresias, Jocasta, and Laius are. Some concepts we've just talked about and you might want to return to. What is the oracle that sort of bounds the life of Oedipus? How is his Theban kingdom in some ways a sort of shadow self or inverse of classical Athens? And is Oedipus a tyrant? And of course, a couple of questions to ask both about Sophocles' context and his messaging, right? What do you think? That's what I'm really interested in. What do you think about what Sophocles is trying to tell us about kingship, about the divine, and about destiny? All right, hope this helped. Please follow up with me if you have more questions.